Welcome to the Ghost Talkers podcast, the show dedicated to unsolved history and paranormal mystery. Each week, we delve into something new, from true ghost stories to conversations with psychics, authors, historians, and the dead. If you're scared right now, it's probably because you just listened to Ghost Talkers podcast.
I'm investigative medium Laine Crosby, here with my co-host, historian and Ghost of Gettysburg author Mark Nesbitt, and you're listening to Ghost Talkers on the ghostchannel.tv. Today, Mark and I are very excited to have our friend Rosemary Ellen Guiley with us to discuss witches, witchcraft, and Wicca, just in time for Halloween. Hey, Mark.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Hi, Rosemary. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks again for the invite. It's truly a treat. Hi, Laine. I am thrilled with your new Witches, Witchcraft, and Wicca Encyclopedia, Rosemary.
Thank you, Laine. I'm really pleased with it, too. Wicca is a very hard topic to stay up to date on because as soon as you write about it, it mutates.
Well, actually, we should, I did want to get into Wicca, but I wanted to talk a little bit about witches and witchcraft first.
Sure.
Because Wicca is so interesting to me, and I don't really know much about it. But, I saw you on Mysterious Journeys on the Travel Channel on the episode that took place in Salem. And I know here in the U.S. we think about the Salem witch trials when we think about the earliest witches in America. But I've looked through your encyclopedia, and you discuss magic spells as far back as medieval times. And also there are really witch hunts throughout time.
That's right.
What is the earliest documented account of witches, besides the Bible, that you found?
Well, I think witchcraft goes back way, way to the origins of human society. Ever since we have documented accounts about ourselves, human beings have tried to control their destiny, control the forces of nature, ensure survival, and we have looked to something supernatural for that. So that has involved magic of some sort. In classical times, for example, ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, Babylonia, every society on the planet has had magical societies and people who have been born, believed to be empowered to do magical things. And they've been known by many names, including witches.
I find it so interesting that you have been able to get so much information. How have you gathered your information about these early cultures?
I do extensive amounts of reading for all of my encyclopedias. I'm blessed by living close to the Library of Congress, where I have access to a phenomenal collection, of course. And I also have my own collection. I have about 4,000 books that I've accumulated over the years. There's been a lot written about witchcraft and magic, especially from academic points of view. And these are very good sources of information. People have gone back to original documents and made translations. There's a lot of anecdotal lore that has been passed on down through the ages. So there's quite a wealth of material. Then also on top of that, I interview people for modern accounts, for people who feel that they've had family traditions that have been passed down through generational lines. I go out and make contacts with groups, organizations, and individuals and interview them about their personal experiences.
I found that really interesting as well in your encyclopedia with your pictures, too. And I want to get into that in a minute. But I found it really interesting that witch hunts have been documented all throughout time. You talk about the Arras witches in 1459 and the Amas witch hunt, and that's the Amas witch hunt in North France. And then you have witch hunts, the Bamberg witch trials in Germany, which is just about the same time as the Salem witch hunt in 1623, which I don't know if one could have, had anything to do with the other or not. How far back do you see these witch trials going? Do you see this as something that is part of human nature throughout time?
Witches have never been very well regarded in society. People have usually been afraid of witches because of their power. Witchcraft is almost always associated with something evil or malevolent. And we have much different ideas about it in some segments of society today. But this has been a fear that people have had, which has been used by organizations and institutions, including the church, to manipulate political events. A lot of these witch trials that I have in the encyclopedia, because the encyclopedia does focus on Western history and the roots of our Western tradition of beliefs about witchcraft, they were under the Inquisition. The Christian church actually was trying to stamp out heresy. There were a lot of rival religions and religious sects in the first millennium of Christianity. Some of them got to be quite powerful, and the church wanted to suppress those or even eliminate them. So the Inquisition actually began against heretics. And after a couple of centuries of this, the church found that public fear of witchcraft could be a very convenient weapon to turn against heretics. If you made witchcraft a heresy, then it was a very big club to use on enemies of the church. So the Inquisition became a witch hunt. The accusations of witchcraft were leveled against political rivals of the church, outcasts from society, Jews, gypsies, members of religious sects, and also against people who were practicing magical arts in their villages. The wise women, the wise men, people who did blessings as well as curses. If something happened bad to someone and they suspected that one of their neighbors had put a curse on them, that victim could go to church authorities and say, so-and-so is a witch, and I have been a victim of their witchcraft. And the church authorities could come and arrest that person, torture them, put them on trial, and even execute them on the grounds of being a heretic, because a witch was someone who was automatically seen as in league with the devil.
Wow. So, in other words, you didn't. If you were upset with your neighbor, it didn't take much to to get rid of him in those days, right?
You know, all kinds of innocent people were tortured and executed in this zealous pursuit of heresy and witchcraft. The Inquisition, the witchcraft part of the Inquisition raged from about the 1400s up into the 1700s. There were even some cases in the early 1800s. The 1500s were the worst. Also the 1600s, where there were these mass trials of accused witches, public burnings, in areas of France, Germany, Switzerland, into the Netherlands, were some of the most violent campaigns against witches and heretics. In England, people were hung, usually. Scotland, they burned some. And it even infected the American colonies. Fear that the devil was loose in the colonies and was influencing people to diabolical acts against other people. There were witches that were tortured and executed, usually by hanging, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, all through the original colonies of America. And that was primarily in the 1600s and even into the early 1700s.
Well, now, Rosemary? I understand that here could be some poor person, that somebody got upset with and claimed that they had put a curse on them, and then that person's tried as a witch. But I mean, that's not what we typically picture as a witch. Where did all this, the pointed hat and the riding on a broomstick and all? Where did all that myth or lore come from? Do you have any idea? Have you ever traced that?
We don't really know exactly where the pointed hat came from as a personification of the ugly hag witch. It could have come from caricatures of costumes of the times during the witchcraft, the heights of the witchcraft persecutions. There were pointed hats worn by a lot of people, and also pointed hats were associated with diabolical things too. The witch riding on a broom comes from the accounts of a lot of tortured individuals that they went out literally kind of out of body or in some other state of being. They didn't call it back then, but they would be in some sort of altered state to go to their sabbats, their wild night revelries with demons and the devil, and they would ride brooms, pitchforks, other farm tools, magical animals, demons transferred into animals. That's where all of that comes from. Now, sometimes the people said that they smeared themselves with magical ointments to do this. There may have been something hallucinogenic in it. But the curious thing is that all of these accounts that were extracted from accused witches under torture, there was never any historical evidence to back them up. There was never any historical evidence found of these nighttime revelries with the devil and demons where babies were roasted and eaten and people paid homage to the devil by kissing his rear end and signing pacts in blood and it seems to be more the zeal of the inquisitors to have this, this fantastic evidence to convict people on. Writings of theologians and witch hunters that claim that witches were doing all of these wild things. And when you torture somebody enough, you can get them to say just about anything.
Yeah. Well, I know, for example, I've done some reading on the Salem witch trials, and that it all started, of course, with I guess Tituba and her spells that she, was that a voodoo? She was a voodoo queen that was in or a practitioner of voodoo that was in the colony at the time. Is that correct?
Well, she did seem to know something about the magical arts. She was from the Caribbean. She and her husband John were brought over by the minister to be servants in the household, and she entertained the children by teaching them, divination and magical games, and it just got very out of hand. But Salem town and Salem village were powder kegs waiting to blow up. All they needed was a match, and the match was fear of witchcraft. There were tensions in the town. There were a lot of social animosities. The whole area was just kind of seething with looking for a reason to blow up.
Okay. Yeah, and of course then the young ladies who got together and started accusing their neighbors and everything of witchcraft, that certainly didn't help.
Hysterical children are involved in more than one dramatic case of witchcraft at the time, and it's mind-boggling today that children claiming spectral evidence, that is, things they could see that others could not, could be introduced in courts of law to convict and execute people. We never allow it today, but back then there was such a great fear of witches, which was whipped up to an extreme by preachers such as Cotton Mather and his father Increase Mather and others, that people were willing to go along with that. And this undercurrent of being able to get back at enemies, too, I think played a large part in that.
We always hear about the witches' coven. When did that start? When did they start to group together, or did they ever? I mean, is that just a myth?
I think it's more myth than actual fact. There are some references to covens from some of the witchcraft trials. For example, there was a Scottish witch, Isabel Gowdy, who claimed that she was in a coveen or coven when she confessed to her crimes. The whole idea of the coven, and that was in the 17th century, about the mid-17th century. There are just a handful of references from the witchcraft trials, but it seems that the inquisitors, the witch hunters, wanted organizations of witches over and over again in the treatises written for inquisitors like the Malleus Maleficarum and other textbooks that inquisitors used to prosecute people. Witches were portrayed as being highly organized. They were in league with the devil. They had written agreements in their own blood where they agreed to pay homage to him and in exchange got demons as familiars and also were endowed with powers to wreak havoc on the living. And here again we find really no actual historical evidence to back this up of any substance. Were these descriptions of covens that were documented in the witchcraft trials, how many of them came under the duress of torture? Now, Isabel Gowdy kind of freely confessed, her activities. There seemed to be some people who just volunteered that, well, yes, they said they were in groups of witches. However, people who have practiced magic throughout history have often banded together in groups. And so there is that concept that a group of people working magic is more effective than an individual working magic. And when modern witchcraft came along in the mid-20th century as a force, as a spiritual, religious, and social force, the idea of the coven was part of that witches should be grouped in these small groups to pursue their magical practices together.
So there is evidence that witches did exist in Salem.
Oh, yes. I think that every society has had witchy people in it. Traditionally, these would be people who were naturally psychic and clairvoyant, may have had natural healing power, learned their herbal lore so that they could mix up potions and remedies. These could be used for either helping or cursing. There's a very ambiguous moral line in magic as to what's appropriate. One person's blessing is another person's curse sometimes. So the moral implications that modern Wicca has put on witchcraft is more of a recent skew on things.
I think our listeners might want to hear a story. I recall a story. I believe you told it on the Mysterious Journeys episode.
There are a lot of ghosts associated with the Salem witches. The witch house where a lot of the interrogations took place is said to be haunted. The area where a lot of them were executed, which has now been, a lot of it's been developed around there, is said to be haunted by the ghosts of the victims.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Coming soon to GhostChannel.tv. A journalist joins the Ghosts of Gettysburg team of investigators to cast an objective eye on the questions surrounding alleged hauntings in one of the world's most historic towns.
That was amazing. So it was a little scary, too.
It's almost dropped 10 degrees.
Wow. Jeremy, is that you making the temperature drop?
Okay, can I just say the hair on the back of my neck just stood up?
Award-winning author Mark Nesbitt. Award-winning journalist Brad Christman. And a cast of hundreds, living and dead, bring you Ghosts of Gettysburg, The Headquarters, a 1-hour special audio documentary available via download or on CD. Coming soon to GhostChannel.tv.
Welcome back to Ghost Talkers on the GhostChannel.tv. Rosemary, I wanted to ask you, you were telling me about a child that was killed in Salem for being a witch.
Oh, yeah, Dorcas Good, Sarah Good's daughter. She was only 4 years old, and she was arrested with her mother and accused of being a witch. And when pressed with the right questions, she said yes, and it kind of seems like a child's imagination today. But imagine putting a 4-year-old child in jail as a witch.
That takes it on this fear of societal fear of witchcraft. That takes it to another level. I mean, how can you got to be pretty scared of witches to take a 4-year-old. You have to be thinking in some other terms. This is not a 4-year-old. It's actually an old hag in a 4-year-old body or some such. It's amazing. Of course, the witch hunts they go on today, don't they?
They do. You know, there were inquisitors in Europe who were very, very sadistic and believed that children should be punished equally with adults, that children who were infected with witchcraft were not able to be rehabilitated or redeemed, and they should be tortured and killed. And children were. Oh. It's revolting today, but it was considered to be justified by these inquisitors back then.
Well, now the idea that a witch will cast a spell is kind of fascinating. I'm reading a book on remote viewing now, and then one of the things that they talk about is the ability for the mind to actually produce external results. In other words, move things. Ingo Swann, of course, there's a famous experiment where he actually made a magnetometer react when it was inside a Faraday cage, which kind of takes the mental powers away from electromagnetism, you know. But there are other cases where the human mind is supposed to be able to even produce evil upon someone else, another person. Now, and I know that there are books written. They're kind of hard to find, but I'm sure you've run into them, with these incantations, these spells that witches have cast or could cast on someone. What's your opinion about that? I kind of a long way around asking you a question. Are there really such things as spells?
I think, Mark, that there are spells that work. Magic is real. Magic is a real force and a real power that can be harnessed. And some individuals are able to do that much more easily than others. They might have like the right natural ability, or maybe they've learned some skills. Most witchcraft is considered to be like a low form of sorcery and spell casting. And a lot of these spells that the early witches said they were like little charms and rhyming incantations that they learned from other people, or perhaps they intuitively made them up. We find more formal spells in the magical books called the grimoires, which took more of a path of the ceremonial and ritual magic, where you had to say certain incantations in certain ways in order to have certain results. And the roots of that, of course, go back into some of the magical practices of antiquity, the early Merkaba and also the Kabbalistic magic from the Judaic tradition, where certain sound vibrations had to be made properly in order to invoke the right entities and get the right things done. But in simple sorcery and folk magic, the spells are frequently very unique to the individual. It's the individual's ability to effect something. It's the spell, the incantation is kind of the tool that somebody needs to align their own inner power with the supernatural power that they're seeking to work with.
Okay. So in other words, it's not the person who's doing this in their mind, making it happen. They're actually using the spell as a request to the other side to have other entities do this for them.
Well, magic doesn't involve a lot of mental power. The three components of the inner power of magic are thought, will, and imagination. And when an individual does a spell, a great deal of intensity has to put into it. There's focus, concentration. There's you summon up this internal energy within yourself. You put it into your voice. You're very emphatic. There are spells that can be kind of muttered under the breath, too. But it's a very focused sort of energy, and there may be some visualizations with other powers, supernatural powers, angels, other kinds of entities, an outcome, sending a force out into the cosmos. Individuals a lot of individuals develop their own unique methods for doing this, just like healers come up with their own variations of things that they learn from energy healing systems like Reiki or bioenergy or Joe Ray. People kind of adapted according to their own intuitive ability and what works for them.
So in other words, this is not something we could just figure out by watching Harry Potter.
That's right. There is a science to magic, so to speak. There's an occult science to it, but it's also highly subjective and individualistic. And most of the really good practitioners that I have encountered in my research on both the witchcraft side and the ritual magic side develop their own kind of secret recipes.
Well, have spells been used for the same thing throughout time, or do you see a shift and a progression of what spells are used for now versus in more ancient times? Or do we have that kind of data?
We do from the anecdotal testimony that's been passed on down through the ages. Early human beings were concerned with survival. That meant being free of disease, putting food on the table, being protected from the elements, and being fertile. So most magic was around those things. In the ancient world, life teamed with benevolent and malevolent forces. There were demonic entities, and not demonic in the Christian sense, but just kind of malevolent entities that were out there that you needed constant protection against, because these entities were believed to be responsible for bad luck and disease and, you know, all the terrible things that happen to people. As we go on through time, magical spells start expanding out into other areas. There are spells for seeing the future so that you can anticipate what's going to happen or maybe even influence it. Spells for finding lost objects and treasures, for acquisition, for enhancing one's life beyond just the ability to survive. And then there's the whole component of magic that's aimed against battering down your enemies, cursing them. The Romans were very big on magic for cursing and destroying enemies. If you didn't like someone, if you had a political enemy, if you even had a rival in an athletic game or a rival in love, you went and got a lead tablet or a piece of parchment, and you consulted an expert, a witch or a sorcerer, and got a curse written down so that, you know, the supernatural forces would take care of them and get them out of the way. And that was considered an acceptable part of daily life. We have a lot different view of that today, where we feel it's wrong, morally wrong, to do even these sorts of acts of ill-wishing against other people. In Wicca, the emphasis is on benevolent magic, healing, prosperity, abundance, protection, well-being, spiritual enlightenment. Although humans are humans. We're always going to have people who will try to turn supernatural forces for their own gain and for the detriment of others.
Rosemary, I could use that spell for finding things. I lose my car keys about half a dozen times a week. So if you could get that to me, and the sooner the better.
I think you just need to ask the fairies, Mark.
The fairies would do it. Okay, they hide it from me.
No, I wanted to bring that up, too, because I read in your encyclopedia that fairies were associated with some of the early witches. And I'm very excited. We're putting up your fairy CD on our website, your fairy magic CD on the Ghost Channel.
I sure appreciate that.
So, actually, I should say, I'm very excited. We have your fairy magic CD up on the Ghost Channel at ghostchannel.tv for everyone to come here and download. It's wonderful. And the meditation part is great, because people ask me all the time how to meditate, and I tell them, I will tell them now, go to Rosemary's CD and download it.
We're selling it too, Rosemary, in our gift shop there at the Ghost House. So
hey, that's great. I can bring some more copies of that too.
Okay.
About fairies. Fairies were associated with witches, especially during the witchcraft trials. This was part of the Christianization of pagan societies and cultures. Fairy lore has been very strong in ancient times as a variety of beings, small-statured people or more supernatural entities that live in a middle realm. between people and things like angels and other kinds of spirits. And fairies have had a reputation for not particularly liking people. They were associated with witchcraft because there's a magical element to them, and there are legends that the fairies have sometimes given witches their powers. So there is that link. And again, it was part of the overall campaign of Christianity to homogenize spiritual beliefs under one roof.
Now, do fairies use spells?
Fairies in folklore, yes, they do cast spells. They are especially well known for bewitching people, putting them into states of enchantment, bewitching animals too. And they can cause problems. They can create mischief. You don't want to cross them, or they will get back at you in some sort of magical way. There are many stories of fairies bestowing gifts on people that have a mysterious way of disappearing if you ever displease them. You know, they will give you money and things and animals, and then if you cross them and make them angry, they can make it all vanish in an instant. Fairies are said to bewitch people and animals and cart them off to Elfland. They're other dimensional reality where time passes much differently, and you can become trapped in that.
You know, Rosemary, thanks to you, I now have a fairy altar somewhere in the ghost house.
Oh, that's wonderful, Mark.
Yeah, or at least it's in the planning stages. We have to put one up because I said something nasty about fairies once, and Carol said, "No, that's it. We got to have a fairy altar." So before too long,
immediate amends were made.
Yes. So I promised them a fairy altar. I better put one up there somewhere.
The fairies like to be treated very respectfully. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Rosemary, let me ask you a question, if I could. Being you know, I am a skeptic. It's getting harder and harder to remain a skeptic with all the stuff that we're doing. But,
I quit being a skeptic a long time ago.
You gave in. Yeah, I don't blame you. I'm next. But I had a question about, do you know if anyone's ever done, and I know you will respond to this because you think pretty much the same way I do in terms of these things. Do you know if anyone's ever done any scientific experiments? In other words, is there any scientific evidence of the success of a spell, that someone would cast? And I know we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that people are absolutely convinced that something happened to them. Has anyone done any experiments that you know of?
Off the top of my head, Mark, I'm not certain. It seems plausible to me that there would be. I know of experiments in parapsychology that have tested components that we find in magic, like psychokinesis, the ability to influence matter with the mind, with
right.
clairvoyance and telepathy and healing power, the ability to project something out from the individual. These would be components that we find in magic, and there is scientific evidence demonstrating those things. Nobody's willing to say prove yet, but like psychokinesis does seem to be a force.
Sure.
That people can influence the physical realm by projecting something out from within them.
You'd think somewhere along the line this would just fail if things weren't going the way you wanted it to, if the spells weren't working. If people kept doing spells and they weren't getting what they wanted, such as the eating of the queen bee. I mean, that's my favorite in your encyclopedia. Before, what was it? Before and rest, if someone ate a queen bee, they could withstand torture or trial. Now, I think O.J. Simpson probably needs one right now.
There are all kinds of crazy beliefs in magical folklore about things that can make you immune, can protect you, can reveal witches.
But who would go and eat a queen bee unless they had found that some spells were working,
Well, these are curious, and I've always believed that folklore has a genesis somewhere in somebody's real experience, and then it becomes embellished over time and passed on down. I think some of these things are discovered accidentally, and that they don't seem to apply universally because they don't always work for everyone. I think that if magic were easy, if witchcraft were easy to do in the world, things would be a lot more chaotic than they are. I think people are experimenting with this sort of stuff all the time because probably every person on this planet wonders at some point, is there anything that I can do supernaturally to make things better for myself? I think it is a real force, but I don't think that it's that easy to harness. There is a group factor, too, and I think we're seeing some scientific evidence of that in research on the development of global mind, that when a lot of people are in unison with their thoughts and intentions, that has a force to it. When you consider all the things going on the planet and all of these, the chaos of conflicting intentions and actions, goals, ambitions, efforts, energetically, it's a madhouse. So the ability of a single individual to influence all of this in any significant way, I think, is very limited.
I was very excited to meet your friend Raymond Buckland at the conference, Raymond Moody's conference last spring, who brought Wicca to America. And he's still around. He was born in 1934, so that's pretty recent. He came here in 1963. Can you explain a little bit about what Wicca is and how far back it's gone in England? What are the roots of it?
Sure, and Ray he's just a lovely man and has written many really good books on Wicca. Wicca really dates to about the 1950s. There were all kinds of stories back in the early days of Wicca that it was an unbroken tradition going back to ancient times, that Wicca as a religion, that witchcraft was a religion honoring pagan gods and goddesses that had been secretly organized and practiced since ancient times. It was a very popular idea that just didn't hang together, and by the 1970s was fairly well discredited. But there are hereditary, generational, and oral traditions of people practicing magic and witchcraft. And in the 1950s, there was an individual in England, Gerald Gardner, who started writing about what he had learned. He claimed, and I think he kind of put a fanciful turn on a lot of this to make it more glamorous, that he had joined a group of witches in England and that they had all of these rituals that had been passed on down for a very long time, and he put it forth as a religion, that witchcraft was a religion. And it just caught on like crazy. England had recently repealed a very old law against witchcraft, and so it was sort of literally able to come out of the broom closet, so to speak. And people could publicly talk about it and even say they practiced it, and it was the right idea at the right time. It was just a media sensation. His ideas about witchcraft, that they were organized in covens. There was a sensational aspect to it because he claimed that they practiced their rituals in the nude. So all these covens started springing up with naked people doing doing rituals, and as you can imagine, it attracted a lot of attention.
Just say, where can I sign up for this?
Some of them still practice without clothing today. It's called skyclad. And the idea of a return to the old pagan gods and goddesses, I think, struck a chord in people. It was exotic. It seemed mysterious. There was something ancient about it that I think called to people on a variety of levels. So this really started spreading around England and Europe, and it got exported to America. And Ray Buckland was really at the head of that. You can literally say that he's the father of witchcraft in America. And so what we call Wicca today has grown out of that. It's a bona fide religious path. It's a pagan, spiritual path which involves many different traditions in it, like Christianity has denominations, Wicca has traditions. Some practitioners still prefer to call themselves witches who practice witchcraft as a religion. But Wicca is a little easier word because it doesn't carry all that inquisitional baggage of diabolical witches, in pacts with the devil.
Well, Mark, you had a great question that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I'm going to call this segment "Witches I've Met" by Rosemary Ellen Guiley. You obviously Raymond Buckland, and how about some other? Give us some your modern experiences with witches, because I think a lot of people listening are thinking, what I was saying, that they're old hags and they fly around on broomsticks and typical Tom and Jerry cartoonish type of a witch. But you've obviously, in your research, have met quite a few. Can you tell us some witches that you've met?
I certainly can, and I resonate with a lot of their philosophy. I'm very eclectic in my own spiritual pursuits, and what most Wiccans are trying to do is follow a spiritual path that honors goddess as well as God. Deity is personified through pagan deities. There's a very strong connection with nature, with some of them, the fairy lore, but certainly honoring the divine in nature. So the philosophical components of witchcraft are very compatible with a lot of contemporary religious beliefs. Selena Fox is another outstanding individual who's been in the Wiccan and pagan community a very long time. She has a spiritual center called Circle Sanctuary, which is oriented to helping people find their home in Wicca. And she conducts a lot of rituals. She does counseling. She's a leader in the community and also in exploring academic pursuits as well. What can the academic community contribute by researching the influences on Wicca and paganism? Christopher Penczak, an outstanding individual who has written quite a few books on the inner and outer temples of Wicca. There's an emphasis now on kind of a shamanic path of Wicca, that is pursuing journeying inward to connect with spiritual forces within and align yourself with, forces in the cosmos as a path of spiritual enlightenment. His books are quite popular with many people. There have been some leaders in the feminist end of Wicca. Starhawk is one, Z Budapest another out in California. Women who have emphasized the Dianic or the goddess element as a way of exalting and expressing feminine spiritual power. A lot of these people, as I mentioned, they're very oriented toward things like green politics, harmony with nature, the same moral and spiritual principles that people in Christianity and other mainstream religions follow.
Well, that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that some of the newer studies on ancient Christianity emphasize the goddess aspect of it, particularly with Mary Magdalene. She was not what the Bible or the church fathers would have us believe she was. There's no evidence she was a prostitute, that she may very well have been Christ's wife. And a partner, an equal partner in propagating these new beliefs that Jesus was passing on. So that, in other words, what I'm saying is that one of the principles of Wicca may very well be a principle of early Christianity that's been forgotten.
Well, I think that's a very good point, Mark. I think that whenever religion becomes well organized and solidified as a machine, as a hierarchy with dogma and power, rankings of power, some of the other things seem to get submerged. This is something that Wiccans and witches feel very strongly about. There's no central authority in Wicca. There's no pope figure. There's no central church. There's no body of people or councils to tell other Wiccans and witches what to believe and how to worship. It's very independent, very eclectic, and critics of this say, well, this is a huge weakness because you must give people organization or they're just cherry-picking what they want to believe, and this spiritually is not good. So, there's two sides to the coin, but I'll tell you, Wicca is one of the fastest-growing religions in the West. People like the fact that they have freedom to pursue their spiritual path as they intuitively feel it should be. And most Wiccans feel that they're very spiritual people. They may not have the same kind of organizational setup to their religion that Christians do, for example, but it's just a different approach. It's a different approach to one's life journey, to the Godhead and Goddess head. I think we all wind up in the same place.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, fascinating. Laine, this is I got to tell you, this is so much fun talking with Rosemary because I learned so much. No wonder she's written encyclopedias.
I know.
So much. This is great, Rosemary. Yeah.
Well, I'm really enjoying being able to talk about this with both of you. It's an interesting topic. I think it's one that really deserves a forum. Witches today still suffer prejudice and persecution. And people who practice Wicca and witchcraft as a religion are misunderstood by others. There are still people out there who automatically call these people devil worshippers. Yeah. And I think we're probably always going to have bigoted thinking in our society about something. But there have been a lot of inroads made for civil rights as well. Wiccans have won recognition of their right to their seasonal holidays, just like we have Christmas and Easter and the other religious holidays. Wiccans have theirs too, and they've been making progress for their own civil rights.
Well, anyone who studies it as well, I mean, not just the goddess aspect of early Christianity aligning with the Wiccan worship of goddesses, of the female. You have other things too that Christianity early Christianity basically tried to overlay a lot of pagan precepts. In other words, the Mithra, the birth of Mithra. Jesus was supposed to have been born historically at any rate in the springtime, yet, the church switched his birthday to Christmas time, December, because that they wanted to overlay and perhaps absorb the pagan beliefs about the birth of the god. And so, you study this stuff, and the Wiccans are not far, as far as I know. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Not very far from some of the early history of Christianity, and previous to that, the pagan philosophies.
Well, that's right, and that was a smart move on the part of the church to overlay its own religious observances on top of the pagan ones, because I think they saw the handwriting on the wall. The pagan people were going to have their festivals anyway at certain times, and so the church just superimposed their own holiday right on top of it. And we find that the pagan calendar of religious and even seasonal or agrarian observances all have some, revamped significance for Christianity.
And it's interesting how we think of Christianity and Judaism and some of the more traditional religions as having more of the family traditions. But I have a friend who's Wiccan, and she has spells from her mother and her grandmother. This has been passed down already for a few generations. Or maybe they were white witches, and now she calls herself Wiccan. I don't know.
Well, I think that there have been family magical traditions in all societies. For example, the Germans who immigrated to America and became the Pennsylvania Dutch brought with them family traditions of the Hexenmeisters and the Braukers, people who had family heritages of being able to spellcast and heal. And those have been absorbed into modern witchcraft and Wicca. And also, now that we've had modern witchcraft since the 1950s, we're seeing several generations now of, the people who became witches, who actively sought initiation as witches back in the 50s. They've had children and grandchildren now, and many of these people have been raised Wiccan or pagan.
Right.
Well, where we are, Ghosts of Gettysburg, that when I first started going to Gettysburg as a child with my parents, of course, one of the more interesting and unique aspects of that were in every gift store you could find these hex signs, and I never knew what they meant, but it goes right back to the witchcraft, early German witchcraft in that area. Of course, it's very strongly German in terms of its settlements, early settlements, and but you see those hex signs, and you hear stories about the powwow women, in that area, which all leads back to the witches and early witchcraft.
And still very strong in like the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. The tradition is much smaller than it used to be, but it still survives. And of course, most of those original hex signs, they were oriented toward things like protection of animals and homes, for love, for marital happiness, for fidelity, for fertility. Again, the basic human needs.
Each one, yeah, you're right. Each one had a different meaning now that I think back on it. And I remember one fellow telling me that if I didn't watch myself, he was going to put the Presbyterian hex on me. I'm like, wait a minute. Hold everything. No such thing.
That sounds ominous.
Yeah, those Presbyterians, when they put a hex on you, watch out. But
a lot of those spells that have survived in powwowing, they almost sound nonsensical, and this is very typical of folk magic. They're little mixes of old family prayers, which probably have pagan roots. They're Christianized elements where, for example, angels might be called on, and then, and this is more out of the Jewish tradition, because sounds have to be, a certain vibration. A lot of them words that we find in incantations, they sound nonsensical, but it's the vibration of the sound. And you find that in the powwowing spells as well, that there's rhyming nonsensical words that they don't seem to mean anything, but it helps in the summoning forth of the power.
Well, Raymond Moody talked about that at the conference when he was saying, there's a lot of these, and a lot of them are even kids' rhymes that put you into a mental state. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle. It's nonsensical, but it's rhythmic, and they have, in other words, these spells may have devolved into these children's rhymes that we hear and that we're all familiar with.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I think that they do get corrupted, and it's, so to speak, and that some of these spells, the words that people say now might be some corrupted version of earlier words, which may have had, and they may have been real words, and they just got turned into sounds.
And which is the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
And ultimately it doesn't matter as long as it works.
Right. I think it's so interesting, Mark, that you mentioned the Christian calendar being a little bit reactionary, possibly, to paganism and the pagan calendar. And, Rosemary, I found it really interesting when I read in your encyclopedia that bells were known to be repellers of witches and evil spirits. And we all know every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings.
At least according to the Jimmy Stewart movie.
Right. And I don't know if that's just Hollywood. Or, you know.
Well, speaking of the times of the year and everything, of course, Halloween. It's October. Halloween's coming up. That was a big pagan holiday. Switching from the summer and the harvest going into winter. And I've always heard that it was a kind of a dangerous time because that's when the dead could take the place of the living, where you could switch places, and that's one of the reasons why we dress up, why we have masks, to fool the dead so they won't take us over. But that, do you think that's one of the reasons why witches are so embedded in the Halloween traditions?
Well, I think things kind of got grafted onto each other. Samhain, or what we call Halloween, it was originally an old, especially Celtic fire festival called Samhain, where, and this was a widespread ancient belief, that there were certain times of the year when the veils between the worlds were open and spirits could freely come into our world. And in the Celtic tradition, that's Samhain, where on that one particular night, the dead can come, demons might come, other kinds of spirits, and have powers in the physical world that normally they didn't have. So you didn't want any trouble. So you did things like you wore masks or disguises. Another very common tactic was to put your jacket on inside out, which seems kind of silly, but it's the idea that if you put your jacket on inside out, the spirits wouldn't recognize who you were, and they would leave you alone.
I'm going to keep that in mind, yeah.
You would walk a crooked path. If you were traveling somewhere, you would walk a crooked path because supposedly spirits can't follow crooked paths. And you would appease them by leaving out offerings of food or honoring them in a ritual. But you had to be very, very careful at this because it was a very tricky time where two worlds came together.
Excellent.
That is so interesting because I was taught growing up that Halloween was the day before All Saints' Day, and so all the ghosts and ghouls had to go back in. They couldn't come back out for a while.
Well, yes, the Catholic Church, of course, adopted that holiday too. There were earlier traditions of the Lord of the Dead having jurisdiction over the fate of souls on that day too, as to whether or not souls would advance into the afterlife or have to remain in some sort of limbo state. And so all of this kind of gets mixed together in more Christianized lore. It's my favorite time of the year.
Oh, me too. It's great. It's a great time of year.
Oh, I love Halloween. Well, I'm dying to do an interview with you on the Ouija boards, but like you said, that's a whole nother subject. Maybe we can do that next year for Halloween.
Well, that's a date because that's another topic that I would love to explore. I have a lot to say on the Ouija board, and it has a very colorful history, and I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn some things about the Ouija.
I have enjoyed this so much. Do you have any more questions, Mark?
No, well, yeah, of course I do. With Rosemary, are you kidding? But I think we're running out of time here. But once again, I just love sitting and talking with Ro. It's one of those experiences that you walk away shaking your head and saying, I got to look some of this stuff up. Where can I go? Oh yeah, her encyclopedias. Because now, Rosemary, how many encyclopedias did you have now?
I've just finished my 9th, and that will be out next year, the Encyclopedia of Demons.
Oh,
wow.
Cool. Great stuff.
Wow.
And these are great reference books. In fact, when I'm doing my Ghosts of Gettysburg series, I usually pick up one of Rosemary's encyclopedias, especially the one of Ghosts and Spirits, and I'll look stuff up and then the problem is I don't get back to writing because you start reading them and they read they read like novels. I mean, it's not like an encyclopedia at all, but they have so many neat things in them, and I just enjoy the heck out of them. So at any rate, it's great to talk to you again, Rosemary.
Well, I sure enjoyed it, Mark and Laine. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and I'll look forward to doing some more things with you in the coming year.
That'll be great.
Do it too. Rosemary, I got to tell you as an aside, I got involved in your Witches Encyclopedia, the second edition, before you added the Wicca in this edition, and I took it to the pool with me this summer, and all the moms were just looking at me. I sat there and read it page by page. My sister might not have as many playmates, but I loved it.
They probably thought you were all studying up how to be one.
That's right. So talk about not being able to put down a book. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you. And I will look forward to seeing you this coming weekend, just in a couple of days.
Yeah, on Friday. Yeah, it'll be great. It'll be great. Looking forward to it.
And thank you to our listeners. You're listening to Ghost Talkers on the ghostchannel.tv. Happy Halloween.